Epigenetics, the new biology. Genetics, epigenetics, biochemistry and the emotions. Disc 1, Chapter 1.
Good morning, everybody. The topic today, as has just been said, is called genetics, epigenetics, biochemistry and the emotions, which is a very long title and was suggested by the Russians as a title back in June, that they wanted a seminar linking genetics and epigenetics and the concept of our approach to functional biochemistry and the link with the emotions. So I ran this seminar, or one very similar to this, the other week in Russia. So what we want to try and cover is a few of the topics of disorders that we come across every day or every clinical day in practice, and where these tie in with the functional biochemistry and the epigenetics. And we thought about the most common diseases that people have and unfortunately die from, although they don't die from all of them. And the number one in this country and in most countries in the Western world, is heart disease, which is a big word because it covers a multitude of different problems, which we'll look at, followed by stroke or cerebral vascular accident. And third, probably on that list, is cancer. Now, after that, there's a range of different disorders. Strangely, heart disease and stroke are the number ones in Russia, but number 3 is very different from ours. Number 3 in Russia is accidents. And when I asked about that, thinking they were traffic accidents, they said, no, accidents in the house, either intentionally or through poor health and safety. So we laugh at our health and safety and make a joke of it, but in fact we're very fortunate. When you go into, I've been into showers in various sanatoriums in Russia, and there's been plugs, electric plugs in the shower, and it makes you really worried. And you see electric wires with nails put through. So health and safety is really very, very important, and we're grateful for what they do, although we're angry about it sometimes. But in this country, cancer is certainly number 3. And as far as that is concerned, for females it's breast cancer, and for males it's now prostate cancer. And they're very similar, as we'll see, in their cause, their etiology. Now, number 4, which is considered to be the fastest growing illness in the world, is diabetes, particularly the type 2 diabetes, the adult onset one, the insulin resistance. And then we thought about other disorders which we see regularly in practice, and of course that is arthritis of some form. Almost every patient is told, oh, you've got arthritis if you've got a problem with a joint somewhere, and usually told, oh, it's your age. What do you expect? Once you get to 40, then you're going to start to wear out. So those 5 are very common things that we come across. So we want to look at those, not in phenomenal detail, but we want to see how they integrate into the concepts which we're teaching. So I'm going to teach you the epigenetic approach to genetic modification. We're going to look at those disorders, and then we're going to look at specific mutations or polymorphisms, as they're called, within the genetic pathway, and how we can identify those using functional methods. We'll be offering some solutions to how and when you use activated vitamins or coenzymes as opposed to the regular vitamin. So an example of that would be pyridoxine, would be regular vitamin B6, and when you might suspect the person actually can't activate that and would require pyridoxal 5-phosphate, the coenzyme, the active coenzyme instead. And we'll be looking at the new concept of the sensory input challenges to deal with emotional and especially subconscious emotional involvement with genetic disorders. So I plan probably more the talking part this morning, and then most of this afternoon will be much more practical, either as demonstration or for you. So probably the hardcore of this and the approach will be more in the morning. So what I did for the Russians is I put together a patient protocol. Okay, because they said at the end of it, well, how do we use all this information? When do we do the polymorphisms and so on? So what we want to do is to work our way back at the end through how you would approach a patient. And I think this is the most important thing that you want to know is how do I apply these ideas to the patient. So I put together the first few slides there is to do with the patient procedure. So let's start with the heart or cardiovascular problems. And these can be summarized up really into groups of problems which are often involve a lot of medication with the patients. And a lot of these medications can interact. I had a patient this week who was diagnosed with liver disorder function, and she produced 7 medications that she was on, 7 different medications. And some of them were more familiar sort of antidepressants, and some were water pills. And once they start on one, they then end up with a side effect, which is not really a side effect. It is an effect of the drug, of course, because it suppresses other biochemical pathways. Then they end up on another medication and so on. And of the 7, one was an anti-inflammatory, a non-steroid anti-inflammatory, and the other was paracetamol. And when I tested them, the one that showed up was actually the paracetamol. All the other medications were tolerant, but the paracetamol was the one that wasn't. And I said, are they making any difference? She said, no, they don't make any difference to the pain at all. I said, well, why do you take the paracetamol? She said, well, I was told to do it. And I said, well, if you're taking out non-steroid anti-inflammatory, do you need the paracetamol in addition? And things both of them weren't really making any difference, and they weren't getting to the cause of what the pain was due to. So it can be just one isolated medication, and that can cause all sorts of problems, including many of these. And the first one that so many people seem to be on is blood pressure pills, isn't it? They've only got to go up, 130 over 80, and they're considered to be hypertension virtually. And it's the same on statin drugs for cholesterol. The goalposts have been moved so much back that their aim, I think, is to get most of the population when they hit 50 onto medication. So hypertension is a very common problem, and it's quite normal, of course, when we're exercising for the blood pressure to go up, and when we're not exercising, it should go down to a resting level. And the resting level of blood pressure really, when I qualified, was considered to be 100 on the top plus your age, was the standard as far as getting a life assurance policy. So if you're 50, then 150 was acceptable. Okay, 155 maybe not. 145 would be okay. Nowadays, it's got down to 120 or 130. So it's just a matter of moving the goalposts. So blood pressure is something which occurs as far as the flow is the difference in pressure against the resistance of the artery. So what we know is that the arteries are like hose pipes. And what happens with the hose pipe when you send water down is the hose pipe is going to dilate a little bit, and then you get a spurt out the other end. And in between the beats of the heart is like the tap being turned on and off. So it's possible that the tap is flowing too fast. In other words, the heart is beating too fast, or the hose pipe doesn't dilate to the pressure, and this is usually due to hardening of the arteries. So if the arteries have become less elastic, obviously the pressure is going to increase inside the hose pipe. And the control of both the heart rate and the arteries is neurological. So there is a hormonal connection here, like adrenaline when we're under stress, but the major control is due to neurotransmitters and brain chemicals operating the width of the arteries. And these, of course, are our friends like noradrenaline of the sympathetic nervous system, which is there to increase blood in certain areas when we're under stress and to dilate in the others. So at times of like shock, we can get vasoconstriction in one area and vasodilation in another, all in the same day. So every single neurotransmitter, as we'll see, can be involved with regulating blood pressure. So histamine, for instance, increases fluid retention in the body, and therefore up goes the blood pressure. noradrenaline. Acetylcholine, on the other hand, operates the parasympathetic nervous system, which generally relaxes blood vessels to keep the blood pressure lower. Excitatory neurotransmitters like glutamate and aspartame can hit the heart, pacemakers, and set the heart off going very, very fast. And so every neurotransmitter can have an effect on blood pressure. So when we come to look at neurotransmitters by looking at the beginning and ending points of the meridians, we can almost predict whether the person's got high blood pressure or not. So the most important thing with a person who comes in with blood pressure is not finding the medication, it's finding the cause, what it is that's out of balance. So high blood pressure is just the result of a problem, like all these things are, of something out of balance. Now, the second most common thing that we come across, or with patients complain of, or tell us of, is that they've got high cholesterol and maybe high triglycerides, and are then put onto medication to lower this, and most of those are put onto statin drugs. Now, what most people don't realize is that cholesterol is very, very important for the cell membranes. So it gives the turgidity or the stiffness to our cell membranes. If we didn't have cholesterol in our cell membranes, we'd be like an amoeba. Every cell would be just all fluidy, made of fatty acids. So we need cholesterol. It's very, very important. And the bad boy is not cholesterol, as we'll see. It's oxidized cholesterol. In other words, when that cholesterol becomes oxidized or hit by free radicals, reactive oxygen species, that's when the danger is that we can get hardening of our arteries. Nothing wrong with cholesterol itself. Now, the other major purpose of cholesterol in the body, in the circulation, is to make steroid hormones. So by lowering down cholesterol artificially and blocking its production, you end up often with a low level of circulating cholesterol to make our steroid hormones in our adrenal cortex and our gonads. And so we begin to shut down our adrenals, and then we get more stress as a result of the effect of that. So what cholesterol isn't eaten, and 2/3 of cholesterol is actually manufactured in the body. So by restricting your input of so-called animal fats into the diet and eggs and things like that, actually doesn't lower blood cholesterol at all. Only in very, very high, extremely high cholesterol levels does dietary intervention have an effect. On a normal sort of, or more commonly increased level of cholesterol, changing the diet makes very little effect at all. Because 2/3 is manufactured inside. And it's manufactured from a substance called acetyl-CoA. That's the substrate for making cholesterol. Now, we make acetyl-CoA in every single cell in our body from glucose. And this is the familiar energy pathway. So when we make energy, or ATP, we make it from the fuel of glucose. So glucose, as we'll see, has to get across the cell membrane barrier, which is another hurdle because that's taken and controlled by insulin. And inside the cytoplasm of the cell, it forms pyruvate, or pyruvic acid. It crosses the mitochondrial membranes then to form acetyl-CoA, which is the substrate for the Krebs cycle. And the Krebs cycle is, or citric acid cycle, is there to produce protons. And the final part of the making of energy is called the electron transport, which occurs in between the mitochondrial membranes, where we make most of our energy. So 32 molecules of ATP are made here, whereas only 6 are made here. So this is more what we call anaerobic, doesn't require oxygen, whereas this part does require oxygen. Now, acetyl-CoA is, the acetyl part is a very important substance because it goes on to make acetylcholine, which is what regulates our parasympathetic nervous system. And CoA is the active coenzyme of vitamin B5. So vitamin B5 is important here in the process of producing energy. Now, the speed, as I've talked to you before, of the rotation of the Krebs cycle, in other words, the metabolic rate of a person, is dependent upon thyroid hormones. So on the day-to-day basis, it depends upon T3. So T4 is not so biologically active in the mitochondria. T4 we primarily make in the thyroid gland itself. And this is then transported to the cells, taken up in by the cells, and converted inside the mitochondria to T3, which is the activated form. And the level of T3 is what spins the Krebs cycle. So if we have too much thyroid hormone, then we get a fast metabolic rate and people lose weight. And if the metabolic rate goes slower, we produce less T3, T4, and then our metabolic rate goes slower and we gain weight. Okay, it's as simple as that, really. So, very, very important here is the speed of metabolism. Because if this slows down, we don't burn the fuel. So at this stage, what we've got is fuel building up outside the door and waiting to be burnt, but it can't get to the boiler. Okay? So therefore, if the boiler is down here, what we've got is all our fuel getting inside into the kitchen where the boiler is, and it's outside the door. So what happens is this builds up. And if acetyl-CoA continues to build up, the body has to do something with it, and what it does is it shunts it here into this complex pathway to make triglycerides and cholesterol. So the way we build up our cholesterol and our triglycerides is because our metabolic rate is slow. Now we know that people who are more subject to this are the red people, the people who weaken to the red-coloured acetate, because red people are predominantly, their major central coordinating gland is the thyroid gland. Okay? So these are the people who normally have a good metabolism, tend to be on the sort of thinner side, but as their thyroid gets sluggish, then they put weight on. Okay? And again, you can have green or blue people who then swap their gland dominance over to becoming red, and then they start to gain the weight because they've got characteristics of the thyroid type of weight gain pattern. So the major etiology or cause of cholesterol problems or high cholesterol is going to be the thyroid. Okay, so we'll come back to looking at thyroid type people, and this is why we said and we've discovered is that red people, or people who weaken to the red acetate, their major problem is cardiovascular disease. Okay, these are the people, as we'll see, who present with all of these cardiovascular disorders that we're just briefly looking at. So high cholesterol is going to be almost, we can tell the people who've got high cholesterol is going to be the people who weaken to the red acetate, who've got sluggish thyroids. Now, cholesterol is then broken down or oxidized through a process of beta oxidation that requires more B5, B2 and B3. And to break the fats down here as far as the triglycerides is concerned, we need hormone-dependent or hormone-sensitive lipase. So lipase is an enzyme that's secreted in the pancreas and flows into the intestine to break down fats, which we eat, into their components of fatty acids. But we also produce lipase into the circulation from the pancreas, and this is a very, very important part of the ability to actually break fats down. So to split a triglyceride into single fatty acids, you need lipase as well as the thyroid hormone. Now, in emergencies, when we're under stress, we can also use adrenaline here to speed up our metabolic rate, and adrenaline here helps us to burn fat. So people who have high adrenaline will tend to burn fat much more easily. So this forms a cycle of glucose coming in, acetyl-CoA, and we either burn the acetyl-CoA in the Krebs cycle to make energy, or we store it as cholesterol and triglycerides. And then providing we've got hormone-dependent lipase and sufficient thyroxine, and then we produce beta oxidation where we burn fat and pop that back into acetyl-CoA. So you can see if you've got a sluggish thyroid here, all that's going to happen is this. You just keep going round and round and round, and this is what happens. Then they end up having a test, and oh, your cholesterol's high, oh, your triglycerides are high, you're gaining weight, and you can't do anything about it because you're stuck here with beta oxidation. The more exercise you do, you just go round and round and round, and you don't lose weight and you don't get the cholesterol down. So this is very important, that the major cause for high cholesterol is the thyroid, or lack of production of energy. Now the third reason we have cholesterol is to convert that into vitamin D. So when we're exposed to ultraviolet, which we're not really exposed anymore to at the moment, over the winter months, the ultraviolet hits the skin and will convert cholesterol, which builds up underneath the skin, into vitamin D, into D3. Now, if your cholesterol level is low, you will then produce less vitamin D. Okay? And this is one of the side effects of being on statin drugs, of course, is that you'll have less circulating cholesterol, and therefore you'll actually synthesize less vitamin D. And some people have gone to the extent of saying, well, high cholesterol actually means you're deficient in vitamin D. So your body's actually manufacturing more cholesterol to pump it into the skin so that you can convert that then into vitamin D. I personally don't find that in my practice. I don't find many people strengthen to vitamin D. You know, I think there are a few people who maybe in the 3 months' time may start to show it. But because we haven't had much of a summer, but we still get the ultraviolet. Okay, even though it was cloudy, we lacked the ultraviolet. People think they don't get the ultraviolet, but in our summer, when it was cloudy, even if you went outside, you still get a suntan. Okay, but you've got to remember that there is no ultraviolet, or very, very little in the ultraviolet, after the equinox, where we are now, till the equinox in the spring. So from the 21st of September to the 21st of March, what happens is the sun doesn't go high enough to give out the ultraviolet. And the way you can determine that is the length of your shadow. It's as simple as that. That if your shadow is shorter than yourself at midday or at any time during the summertime, then you will be producing vitamin D. Okay, because the sun is up higher than 45 degrees, and therefore you will have ultraviolet A, which will produce the vitamin D. When your shadow is longer than yourself, the sun is lower, which means you won't be producing vitamin D. Okay? Now, most people in the summer months produce enough vitamin D in themselves and store it for about 3 months. So this is why you won't find many people with vitamin D deficient at the moment. But if you check them then in December or January, they may then begin to show it. Okay? So a nice winter holiday in the sunshine would be a good idea, okay, for all of us, but not until December or January. Okay? If you go away in October or November, you're only going to build it up for maybe till January or February time. So there is this third theory that high cholesterol may be the lack of sunshine and a lack of vitamin D, and the body just producing more cholesterol to stimulate more internal production of vitamin D. So that gives us an overall view here. Now in kits which we've talked about, demonstrated, and a lot of you got, are two types of cholesterol. There's the ordinary cholesterol, or to what they do a total cholesterol level, and there's oxidized cholesterol. And it's the oxidized cholesterol that we'll see is the bad guy, especially in association with hardening of the arteries. So here, sorry, it hasn't come out very well, is a picture of the first pathway of producing energy. So this is called glycolysis. So we've got glucose coming in here, and then we've got pyruvate as the end result. Now, one of the major things we know of is pyruvate then goes on through the mitochondrial membranes into making acetyl-CoA. If pyruvate doesn't go across the mitochondrial membrane and pyruvate builds up, it shunts it into making lactic acid. And lactic acid is one of the major things that makes us feel very tired, and it also gives pain. So many of our patients complain of both that, of tiredness and of pain. And I think sometimes we forget to test with lactic acid people who are in pain. Okay? And this was the case with this lady who was on all this medication, and especially the anti-inflammatory medication, is she was in pain and nobody was addressing the cause of the pain. And the major causes of pain or inflammation in the body is allergy, you know, something that people are eating. It's chemical toxicity driving the production of free radicals, and it's infection. Okay? Those are the major causes. But none of those showed with her. Okay? So her problem was she's got high lactic acid, and we very often forget that lactic acid gives pain. You know, ask any athlete, they'll tell you that. So lactic acid is merely a shunting of pyruvate to lactic acid because you're not burning the pyruvate to get that across the Krebs into the Krebs cycle. So what happens here with the acetyl-CoA is it goes through this complicated process of building different molecules of saturated fats, and the major ones that get deposited in the system is carbon-16, which is palmitic fatty acid. That's the soft fat, which is like butter. So when you get hold of somebody and they're really lovely and cuddly, that's palmitic fatty acid. Then carbon-18, which has a slightly higher melting point, is stearic acid, And stearic acid is candle wax, so you can see that's really quite hard. So when you give that person a cuddle and they feel like a hard lump, then they're more likely to have stearic acid. So the classic triglycerides, which people store, is a combination of these two. Okay? So it's usually 2 molecules of palmitic and 1 of stearic, something like that. The longer the fatty acid chain, the higher the melting point. So the next one up is carbon 20, which is arachidic, and finally carbon 22, behenic. Those are the 4 major ones that can form triglycerides. These are very much higher melting points. These are really difficult fats to shift. You've virtually got to boil the patient in a vat of hot water to get them to melt. Okay? So remember, to get these are stored as triglycerides, in other words, 3 molecules. So to break those 3 molecules apart, you need hormone-dependent lipase. Okay? So to get that to move, you've got to have A, produce lipase from the pancreas, and B, you've got to have thyroxine, or T3 and T4, in order to speed the metabolism up. We then break those triglycerides down into the 3 original molecules, such as palmitate or stearates, and then that goes through the beta oxidation pathway and produces acetyl-CoA, which should then pop into the Krebs cycle. Now, acetyl-CoA here, we can see, forms cholesterol over here. So acetoacetyl-CoA here, and then hydroxymethyl-glutaryl-CoA, or HMG-CoA is the intermediate here, mevalonate, and then on to farnesyl pyruvate, and then on to cholesterol. Now, farnesyl pyrophosphate also is the substrate for making coenzyme Q10. Now, CoQ10 is a very, very important component inside the mitochondrial membranes as an electron transport to produce the last part of making energy. So if you don't have enough CoQ10, you have great difficulty making enough ATP. So the problem here is that the most famous drugs, the statin drugs, are called HMG-CoA reductase, that's the enzyme here, inhibitors. Okay, so that's how they work. So they inhibit this enzyme. So we know that enzymes need cofactors, like minerals, and coenzymes, like vitamin Bs, etc., to upregulate them. But we forget that poisons, certain chemicals, toxic metals, and exposure to ionizing radiations can damage our enzymes and inhibit their function. Okay? And this is how they found by mistake that the statin actually reduced or inhibited this enzyme, and down came the cholesterol, which is fantastic for people with high cholesterol. But at the same time, down goes the CoQ10, because like with most drugs, you're going to have effects. They call them side effects, but they're really the effect of the drug is to inhibit the production of farnesyl pyrophosphate, which reduces, unfortunately, the CoQ10. So it's very important that people should take CoQ10 if they're on statin drugs. Okay? If they're not on statin drugs, then there's no point in taking the CoQ10. They should manufacture their own CoQ10. But if they don't, there's a chance that the amount of ATP produced in the high ATP areas of the body will become insufficient. And the area of the body that produces most ATP is the brain. So the neurological system uses more ATP than any other cellular structure, weight for weight, far more than even the muscle system. So weight for weight, the brain, the nervous system produces much more ATP. There's a lot of mitochondria there. So if a person is on statins, they may find they produce low levels or lower levels of CoQ10, in which case they produce lower levels of ATP, and so the brain cells, the neurons, can no longer pump out sodium and calcium, where they use the ATP as sodium pumps and calcium pumps, which means they get a build-up of calcium and sodium inside the cell, and when that gets to a certain concentration, which is generally accepted to be about 20%, the nerve dies. Okay, that's it, because once the nerve has died, the nerve has died. You know, it fills up, it becomes like stone. Transneural degeneration, it's called. And this can occur quite rapidly, and of course is irreversible. Okay, now we now know that we do grow new neurons from stem cells, but not in the same rate, unfortunately, that we usually degenerate. So a person on statin drugs may degenerate much faster. okay, it's because they have less energy. So this person may be blessed or reduce the risk of a myocardial infarct, but an increased risk of getting heart failure or heart myopathy because the heart muscle is getting tired, and therefore they're more likely to get heart failure, which is great because then you can prescribe another lot of drugs for the heart failure and a lot of water pills, and this is how they end up on 7 or even more. When I sort of talk like this in America, they tell me, oh no, our patients, the average is 10 or 12 drugs, different drugs. That's right, no.
I think at 70 the average is
10 drugs by age 70. Yeah, absolutely incredible. So it's very easy to get, hooked into this and never address the original reason why you had the problem in the first place. So we generally suggest 30 milligrams of CoQ10 for every 10 milligrams of statin. That's the general sort of rule. So if you have to have statins and your patient insists on staying on them, do try and make sure that they can produce their own CoQ10. Normally, we produce CoQ10 without a problem in our bodies from acetyl-CoA, which, of course, as I say, is the active form of vitamin B5. We then make our own farnesyl phosphate, pyrophosphate, and then with the addition of the amino acid tyrosine and vitamin B6, or more specifically pyridoxal 5-phosphate, how the body uses, and S-adenosylmethionine and vitamin C, we make CoQ10. So you can see you shouldn't normally need to take CoQ10 for the average person. You need to make it yourself. In fact, it concerns me that if a person takes CoQ10, unless they're actually on medication, that they're going to inhibit making their own. Okay? So it's dead easy to say, oh, what you need is CoQ10, boost your energy up, and you take it and you say, yes, I feel better. But you stop taking the CoQ10, you go back down again. So it hasn't actually solved the problem. Whereas if you look at the components that make CoQ10, like the P5P, the SAM, and vitamin C, and oxygen, then you're more likely to make your own. Okay? There's our friend oxygen, and we talked a lot about that in previous recent seminars, because hypoxia is one of the most common conditions that you come across. Lack of oxygen into the system is so important where oxidative processes occur. So you see that people lacking oxygen usually are due to lack of iron or lack of one of the B12s. And the most common symptom of that is tiredness, isn't it? When you've got lack of oxygen, you get tiredness. And one of the reasons for that is your level of your CoQ10 has dropped down, so you just don't produce ATP in your mitochondria. So remember, the cholesterol is made from acetyl-CoA, which is made from the glycolysis pathway in producing energy, and it goes on to make CoQ10, which is the good guy, and cholesterol. Now, in things that can influence cholesterol in order to help it break down, certainly there's been a lot of interest in high levels of niacin, and ideally non-flush levels of niacin, but the amount that you need is a pharmaceutical level. You need quite a number, a few hundred milligrams of B3 of niacin to do this. Some use 800 to 1,000 milligrams, that high. So this is a massive, massive amount. You're talking about the amount of eating a whole liver every day, to get the B3 in there. So it's almost, as I say, it's almost a pharmaceutical, certainly more than an orthomolecular. But B3 nonetheless is important. Vitamin C is involved here. The trace element copper, oxygen, again in the oxidative processes, again we need B12 and iron, and B5 or CoA. Now that cholesterol is then made into bile salts in the liver, and those bile salts are conjugated with the amino acids taurine and glycine, and then that bile salts which are secreted and the cholesterol is transported from the cells where the cholesterol is oxidized by phosphatidylcholine or lecithin. So this is the carrier that carries it from the damaged cell across to the liver to be made into bile. And we can get the phosphatidylcholine oils component from plant oils, which we'll talk about, so the different plant oils. We need to speed our metabolism up in order to get our T3 and T4, which we need to look after our thyroid, which is going to be iodine, and selenium to help in the conversion of T4 to T3. Okay? So those would be the common nutrients that you might consider with your patient who comes in and says, I got high cholesterol. On the natural medicine phytoceutical side, cayenne pepper has a good record there. I think cayenne certainly is a vasodilator. You know, it brings a flush to your face pretty quickly. And there is this idea that if you feel you're going to have a heart attack, you know, swallow some cayenne pepper pretty fast because it will help to dilate the blood vessels. So using cayenne pepper and suggesting that with people with high cholesterol might be a good idea. And garlic. And garlic probably works because it reduces the blood viscosity. So all in all, looking to get the right oils into the patient is fundamental, as we said all the way through, and we'll see it's fundamental to all of us. Getting a good mixture, again, of the vitamin Bs, B5, B3, B12, etc., coming up here, and iodine and selenium. So you're beginning to see a little pattern here. This is the first of many disorders that we'll look at of the requirements of a person who's presenting with high cholesterol and high triglycerides. And I've already told you the secret here is that you've usually got sluggish thyroids, and so you think, that's the red type, biological type or constitutional type of person. So when we come to look later on at summarizing the nutrition that a red person requires for their overall health, we find that it's always the same. Every single person who weakens to red will show to the same nutrients, okay? Because that's why they're red. They've got the same constitution. So they all need these nutrients, okay? But it's not necessarily that they need taurine and glycine and so on, but there are particular plant oils which are unique to the red person. And there are particular vitamin Bs. So we'll build up a profile the other way around. I'm going to talk about the diseases, but we want to talk about why the people get the diseases in the first place and how a red person, as we'll call them, can avoid cardiovascular problems and work epigenetically to optimize those enzymes which are not working as well as they should be. Okay, so all about cardiovascular disease is more about the red type of body type.
End of chapter 1.